good morning to everyone, and thank you all for attending this year, and we hope to see you all again next year. So, 20 years ago, these folks up here at this table, we sat in that classroom over there as brand new students, and little did we know, like, who the hell are those people? Little did we know how profoundly our lives would be impacted by CHDS and what went on in the classroom across the way, and I have to be honest, in the bars of Monterey. So, I'll just start this by saying I thought a reunion of five, I'm just going to call them five musketeers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one. So number one, to my right, is Kathy Lanier. Way back when, she was a new commander from DC Metropolitan Police Department. I did make the mistake of saying DC Metro once, and she smacked me on the side of the head and said, it's Metropolitan, don't say Metro. I think I got it. They're very picky about that. So, as I came to find out, and when Chris Bellavides was doing the intro course, that Kathy liked to raise her hand and answer every single question. Multiple times. She's going to smack me in a minute. So this went on, and every time she did it, Bellavides saw it as a challenge, and he would try to twist her in knots in responding, and because I was unlucky enough to be sitting next to her, he would then pick on me too. So I leaned over at one point and said, are you going to do this for the next 18 months? And she just kind of looked at me, and I said, because if you are, I'm moving. Well, she did for the next 18 months. She then got promoted through DC Metropolitan Police Department and ended up as the police chief there for 10 years, 2007 to 17. 2 different mayors, and that is significant. 3 mayors. That's even more significant. To be able to handle the politics of not only DC Metropolitan, but Washington, DC in itself. Then she texted me once in about 2017 and said, I've just been hired as the Senior Vice President for Security by the NFL. I wrote back, well, congratulations. What do you know about football? She said, thank you, nothing. And I said, perfect. She just finished her 9th Super Bowl without. And I don't know how much football she does know now, although nothing. I think she was the defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. I heard.
That's harsh.
Okay, so, and as I think you'll hear as we go along here, the profound impact of individuals on each of us and how we're still friends, we're still in contact, and we still depend upon each other for the things that life throws at you, not just from a professional standpoint, but a personal one also. So I can't say enough thank you to all of you for sitting up here with us today. Musketeer number 2, G.B. Jones. He, way back when, was a ASAC from Milwaukee, FBI. And I'll just say this, a little test, without looking, what is he wearing? I always say, you can take the man out of the FBI, but you can never take the FBI out of the man. White shirt, dark jacket, right?
I wear a blue shirt on Casual Friday.
Back in 2004, GB, like I said, was in Milwaukee, but he also had a very unique connection to the 9/11 incident and report about a guy named Moussaoui and a computer, a laptop, that he was trying to get headquarters to let him open. So, and in one of the most incredible statements, and if you recall, I know all of you have read it and seen it, the 9/11 Commission report, GB actually said, look, all I'm trying to do is to stop somebody from flying a plane into the World Trade Center. When did he say that?
25th of August, 2001.
About 2 weeks before somebody did. So, musketeer number 3 is unfortunately Joe Pfeiffer from FDNY. Sadly, on Monday, his brother-in-law passed away unexpectedly, and he is unable to be here. I'm going to read something he wrote in a little bit, not right now, but everybody knows Joe Pfeiffer, I think, in this business we're in. He was the battalion chief first on scene on 9/11. He escaped from one of the towers as it was collapsing after asking, why is everybody running out of the other tower? That's a whole story in itself. Ended up getting promoted, he was the chief of counterterrorism for FDNY, and just recently the first deputy commissioner for FDNY. And so we're thinking of Joe, and we wish he was here with us today. I'll call myself musketeer number 4. As I said, I was sitting over there trying to figure out what Chris Bellavita was talking about, for the most part. Just like I do on Rodrigo, this is a compliment. It usually takes me about a month to figure out what Rodrigo's talking about. And then somebody has to explain it to me in very plain English, exactly what it is. He is an amazing thinker and an amazing mind. So, I spent 35 years as a cop. I've spent many years as a contractor with the Central Intelligence Agency. And I've been doing this intel course in this program for unbelievably 18 years. Over 150, 60 theses, 30-some Fusion Center Leaders programs, and it's really been a remarkable journey, and I enjoy every minute of it. And looking out here today, I see all these faces that I looked at in class, and I always marvel at how dedicated, smart, and the initiative that all of you have in this business we're in. The musketeer, well, and I will add, one of the things that, and I'm sure anybody from the Intel course, you may remember 2 things. One, in 1987, I had brunch, yes, brunch, with Pablo Escobar, just him and I. And I'll leave out some of the finer details, but I assisted in bringing a male and female hippo to Colombia. What could go wrong, right? Well, little did I know, hippos do 2 things. One of them is eat. You can guess the other one. And there are still hippos in Colombia, and they can't figure out how to get rid of them because they devastate the environment. Oh well, unintended consequence, right? So, musketeer number 5, sitting to my left, Dr. Dave Brannon. Everybody here knows Dave in a variety of ways. He's been, and I say he's musketeer number 5 because he is the lone remaining instructor from 0401 that is still instructing. And what was a rather unique story is that I've known Dave for over 45 years. He went to the police academy with my brother. He ended up as a drill instructor. I taught criminal law, and I used to go out and watch he and my brother terrorize cadets. And then he went on to work several different things. And as everyone knows, Dave likes to fight. And what happens when you fight? You get hurt. And he ended up retiring from the sheriff's department. Kind of lost track of him. I'm sitting in class in 0401, and who walks out but Dave Brannon? I didn't know he was one of the instructors, and he didn't know I was in the class. And the unique part was he is just back from Iraq. still had broken ribs, and was clearly sometimes would revert to Iraq when he would duck at the slightest noise. So I'll just caution everyone, no loud noises, or he may just flip out on us.
I may flip out on you anyway.
I know, I never know. I didn't want to sit next to him because he still likes to fight, but other than that. So one of the things that I was intending to say today was I taught these musketeers one of the endearing facts of being in California, California wine. No more $2 chuck, no more $6 bottles of wine. And it was epitomized one night at a restaurant here in town. We all went out, including Dave, and I ordered a couple bottles of Opus One. The cheapest Opus One is about $180 a bottle, so it's very good. The sommelier came out. He thought it would be important that what idiot ordered these 2 bottles of Opus One. He wanted to pour each one of us a taste of it, and he started. We went down the line, and it got to Dave, and he didn't sip it. He drank the whole thing, and not in the history of the universe has anyone ever said, after tasting Opus One, boy, that is good hooch. I thought the sommelier was going to pass out right there at our table, and we could not control our laughter, and Dave, of course, said, "What's wrong with everybody?" It is. So, those are the 5 musketeers.
You
and
realize I have a mic, and I'm going to get back at you.
for 45 years, you've been trying. Anyway, as I said, I thought it would be a fun idea and impactful if we got everybody back here together and talked about 20 years and the impact of CHDS on our lives, our careers, our profession, and how important those days sitting in that classroom across the campus were and remain, and I hope all of you have that same feeling in 20 years. I think we'll still be around, I'm not sure.
Some of us will.
Okay. So anyway, I am going to turn this over to Dr. Dave, and we're going to have a discussion about a couple different things. And as I'm sure as we discuss, things will pop in our head that not only remind us of our time here, but what I said, the impact of CHDS, and how thankful we all are that we ended up in that class sitting next to each other wondering what the hell we got ourselves into. And you know what? Today, 20 years later, I think we know. So.
I'm looking down front, and there's Chief Dial right at the front. And he is actually the first, and is there anybody else from your cohort here?
I think Jay Hagan.
Okay. So that was the first cohort and that was 03, 02?
Yeah, 03, 04.
Okay. So first of all, yes, I did have still some broken ribs and some metal in me at that point, and I was a little jumpy. So because Pat is so kind and thoughtful, you won't know there's another graduate of the program named Sharon Cottle, and she already had a PhD, and she could be harsh, let me put it that way. And I'm nervous just getting back, and I'm not teaching threat. You know, I'm not doing terrorism. I'm very comfortable with terrorism. I like terrorism, but I was teaching law enforcement and judicial issues in Homeland Security at that point. And I walk in, and I'm not being very effective, and I'm super nervous because it turns out these students are really freaking smart. But this story will give you a little insight into exactly who you are. You're not just smart, you're also smart Alex. And that is dangerous and it's fun, but it rears its head in ugly ways. And I'm getting into my lecture, and this lady, Sharon Cottle, stands up and says, you know, that's a bunch of bullshit, and I'm not going to sit here for it anymore, and walks out. And I was not happy. And I didn't know exactly how to respond to that. And then the person sitting next to her said, yeah, she's exactly right. There's no reason for us to be here, and walks out. And each one of these knuckleheads gets up in series, GB and Kathy and Joe Pfeiffer, who's a nice man, but on that day he was not so nice, until this moron is the last one sitting there with his arms folded, laughing at me. Yeah.
We were all in the hallway laughing.
I was ready to cry, and it was problematic. You know, it really does illustrate the kinds of people you are, though. You don't put up with BS. That's one of the great things about CHDS, is you don't put up with BS. And you challenge each other to go to the next place. This place tends to matriculate. I know all of you think you're individuals. It tends to matriculate a kind of person, a person who's really inquisitive and wants to figure out the next thing. I say that all these classes are absolutely the best because they're absolutely individual from the other in exactly the same way. They are full of people that are inquisitive and want to figure out the next thing. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to pitch some softballs to start with, but this is about reconnecting with not only the people from your class, but reconnecting with the people that may make it possible for you to do something great in your current job or the next job by interacting with people across this great network. And I'm just kind of wondering if you guys can talk about any way that the network has impacted your life now, or maybe throughout those 20 years.
Before you guys go, let me, I mentioned Joe Pfeiffer, and unfortunately he's not here, but he did send me a couple thoughts on email, and I think it's worth reading a couple of these that he talks about, and I'll just go quickly through this. And this is now Joe talking. It's been fun talking about sitting in the classroom together, but it was our wonderful dinners together, and Pat, using fine wine, got us to tell stories, a big part of what we do here in Monterey. And somehow we discovered that we were chosen by history to make a difference. CHDS was more than Homeland Security education. It played a significant part in our coming together to reflect on the past, envision the future with a purpose to enhance the present. Because of all of you, a firefighter from Brooklyn became chief of counterterrorism, something that was unheard of, and I hope it resulted from hanging out with the cops. I got to give it to him for that one. Little did I know that Chris Bellavita and Paul Stockton would encourage me to write a thesis that I later utilized in my work. He also wrote a book called Ordinary Heroes. If you haven't seen that, it's worth a read. And for each of us, and we all together accomplished over the last 20 years, I take from CHDS our continual friendship as being the most valuable. I think that's pretty profound, and I just wanted you to hear that from him.
So, Kathy, can I go to you first? Even though he interrupted me when I had this perfect setup, but never mind.
So I'd say the biggest impact for me, and my first semester here, I was my capstone semester at Johns Hopkins in my master's program there. So I was double mastering for the first semester. And I was a 4.0 student at Hopkins, so I thought I was this smart, you know, I was going to be this great student, and I was going to come in here and just ace right through it, and it was certainly nothing like that. Chris Bellavita cut us all down to size very quickly in our first class with nothing but red ink on everything we turned in. The biggest thing for me from the program has been the long friendships that I've made here, as evidenced by the people at the table and Joe, who is not with us. I went through a bachelor's and a master's program at Hopkins, and I don't have any friendships like the friendships I made here. And they're friendships that have continued on. So shortly after I graduated from the Naval Postgraduate School, not too long after, I got nominated to be the chief of police in Washington, D.C., and I emailed my group of friends who lived all over the country, from California to Illinois, and said, hey, believe it or not, they're going to make me the chief of police. And all of my friends from the Naval Postgraduate School all showed up in Washington, D.C. for my swearing in. Joe Pfeiffer actually spoke at my swearing in. We've been in that kind of friendship and that relationship ever since. So 20 years, there's not a time in life when I have not been able to pick up the phone and call any one of them and ask for help or likewise offer any help to any of them. And we've worked together and done a lot of things together in the process. The other thing is the network that you have here. It's really an unbelievable network. I was at dinner last night. I was getting emails from another student from another class I've never met before, and I get probably 2 a month from other NPS, so CHDS students who say, you don't know me, but I know that you're an alum from the CHDS, and can you help me with a topic? Or this particular gentleman was looking for information on threat assessments for stadiums. And I make time, always, to talk to anybody that reaches out to me and asks for help, because there's times when I want to reach out to others and ask for help. And it's just a network like you're not going to find anywhere else. And you should use that network, because people that come through this program are always going to be willing to help you, and you should always be willing to help them. And then lastly, I'd say the opportunities that came my way. Remember, we went through this program right after 9/11, very close after 9/11. We were trying to figure out a lot of things that didn't exist. And that was different than the programs that I'd gone through before, than my master's program at Hopkins. We were really trying to create something that wasn't yet in existence. And for GB, a brilliant student, but his work at the Naval Postgraduate School, I'm sure he'll mention, resulted in what is now the SEAR rating process. There was no process to figure out how to support, for federal agencies to support state and local law enforcement and state and local governments for large special events, until GB put his mind to it as a part of his studies at the Naval Postgraduate School. I wrote a very basic thesis that, when I look back on it now today, I think, God, how fundamentally simple this was compared to some of the work that my colleagues did. But because I did my thesis work on integrating state and local law enforcement into the intelligence cycle, I was later asked to be on the information sharing environment by President Bush, and I was the only state and local that was a part of the ISE development, which was the direct result of the 9/11 Commission. It was one of the recommendations from the 9/11 Commission. So I got to participate in that because of my work here on the thesis. And there's no doubt in my mind that I got tapped to be the chief of police in Washington because, in large part, because of that time that I spent here and some of the work that I did because of it. So I don't compare this program to anything else I've done in my life, because it's had lifelong impact for me, not only in my career, but in my personal life, and lifelong connections that really are just immeasurable.
Yeah. It's neat that you make time when you see it's from somebody
Always.
from CHDS. And I hope that we're all doing that. Because that is exactly, it's not just a reciprocity issue, and that's what we have said, why we want to come here is because we want to make a difference. And that's how you make a difference. GB, I know most people won't talk to you because of your prior life, but do you have some network or something?
Or other reasons.
Yeah.
Well, first I'll set the record straight. It's actually Gregory B. Jones, but when I started in the FBI, there were 4 Gregory B. Joneses. So they took my real identity, reissued me an acronym, said EBGB, and that was it. So my official name was GB Jones for the next 23 years until I retired from the Bureau. But Dave, you said something here about this opportunity to come back to Apex and to reconnect with your classmates. But what's really unique about the experience that we've had is we've never disconnected from one another. We never had to reconnect because for 20 years we have been really, really tightly woven. There were so many things that we talked about, so many things we experienced together, and so many things we went through in our lives together, both during the time that we were here and in the time after that, professionally and personally, that disconnection never really happened. And we always had CHDS as an excuse to come back together. I still teach occasionally with the executive education program, and I think that is one of the best things CHDS has going, because it projects power forward. It takes these kind of critical thinking skills and takes them out to the folks that are practicing in the field for major special events that are coming to their towns. People that wouldn't have the exposure to the critical thinking that you get to do here during the time that we got to do here during the time that we were master's degree students. And I would posit that I certainly would not be in the position that I am in right now as the Chief Safety and Security Officer for the upcoming FIFA World Cup 2026, but for this experience. Kathy talked about the thesis that I wrote. The FBI actually had a way of rating and resourcing special events. They called it the SEAR rating system, or Special Event Readiness Level, and we had it for 10 years. And then DHS came along in 2004 and said, hey, we want to do that, and we called it Special Event Homeland Security. And they aligned like this. And I said, this is dumb. We shouldn't have two different ways of rating and resourcing special events across the US government. We should have one system. And so I coined a term called SEAR, Special Event Assessment Rating. I was the unit chief of the FBI's Special Events Management Unit at the time. So I could take away what the FBI had been doing for 10 years. And I went to DHS and I said, if you'll do away with what you've been doing for 2, we can come up with something that's objective, fiscally responsible, and repeatable, and have one way to rate and resource special events across the US government. So I've just come up with the term SEAR, but we can call it whatever you want to do. And I got DHS on board, and the Secret Service on board, and the White House on board, and the FBI on board, and we changed it. It was one person that made a difference, and it all happened because Chris Bellavita and Dave Brannon, who were both my thesis advisors, pushed me to say, this is something that could make a difference. And the whole reason that I came to CHDS was because thinkers here were making a difference, but the FBI wasn't represented here. And I was fighting interagency policy battles back in Washington that were the product of thought leaders that were out on the West Coast that I'd never heard of, in a little schoolhouse that I'd never heard of. But I was going up to Capitol Hill, and I was working with people in the Counterterrorism Division and the Critical Incident Response Group, and we were putting together what was first the National Response Plan, now the National Response Framework, and had all kinds of things that we were trying to codify what the FBI was already doing. And then we get these haymakers coming off of Capitol Hill saying, well, we're going to create this agency to do this, or that program to do this, and it was already in the lanes that we were already in. And I thought, how are they coming up with these ideas, not appreciating what the FBI is already doing in that space? How about we get together and talk about these things and deconflict what we're already doing before we start replicating other things? So I went to the FBI director's office and I said, hey, nobody's ever represented the FBI out at this little schoolhouse. I'd like to be the first so that we can get in where the discussions are happening before they're pushing information out to legislators to make change. And they said, all right, well, you got to do that in addition to your day job, but why don't you go ahead and try it out and then come back and report back to me. And so I was the first FBI agent to come through with another colleague.
He was a spy. He
That's
came in
right.
as a spy.
And then when I left here, I endorsed the program and I said, there's absolutely not a cohort that goes through here that shouldn't be represented by somebody from the FBI. So we have a voice at the table, and importantly, so that we are collecting information, not intelligence spy work, but collecting information from others in the Homeland Security space that are going to make us better. And so that was really my introduction to this. And what I learned here was the critical thinking skills that allowed me to step up and say, when the hardest challenges and the hardest tasks came by, yeah, we can do that. We can do that because we chunk it out. We do, small bites at what is a really, really big challenge and a big problem. And some of the things just that I had the opportunity to be a part of as a result of that were, again, talking about the National Response Framework, responding to Hurricane Katrina as a subject matter expert on behalf of the FBI because I wrote the manual that the FBI used to respond to natural disasters. And that's not one of the central themes of the FBI is natural disaster response, but we had an opportunity and we exploited it. We were doing hard stuff. Render safe. In 2005, the FBI was given the mission to render safe improvised nuclear devices in the United States because DOD was really busy with other things overseas and they didn't have the capacity to do it. So somebody somewhere in 1999, even before 2001, said at some point we need to transition this responsibility. And the Bureau started building technical capacity to do that, building bomb cutters that could literally render safe a nuclear weapon. But a year before we were to take on the mission, they said, oh, but nobody's really thought about how we're going to knit together the command and control piece. And so they came to me and said, can you do this? So because I was in the program, because I knew others in the space, I knew Kathy, who was by then the chief, she was an SOD commander, I guess. So I knew what they were doing in the NCR, and that was our initial area of focus, that National Capital Region. And so I knew her, and I knew I could leverage her. I could talk to Joe about what the impact of that consequence management piece were going to be, and I could talk to Pat about what he knew about what the intel community needed to be. And that was the framework around which I wrote a command and control plan for rendering safe nuclear weapons if they came to the United States. Everything that I've done that's been really hard has resolved back to the skills I learned here or the network developed from here.
I'll just add a couple things also to go not only what Kathy and GB said, but I found myself in 2010 sitting in Bogota, Colombia, meeting the new station chief that had just taken over there. And the meeting was about goals, objectives, how we wanted to approach a couple different problems. So I was expecting a 3 or 4 hour brief with all kinds of material. He had a matchbook cover, and I'm not kidding, wrote 2 things on it and said, "This is what I want." I started to ask a question, and he said, "No, you're a smart guy, figure it out, just go do it." So I walked out of that office, I looked down at it, and I said, well, I guess if my critical thinking skills were ever going to kick in, I hope they do now, because I got to come up with something in the next couple days. And, you know, I look back at it, and I remember talking a few months later to Chris Bellavita again. You hear that name a lot here, but he had such an impact. Talking to Bellavita, and he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I sat down and I wrote down 3 or 4 things under each one and kind of went from there. And he goes, then you did learn something. I said, I'm not giving you all the credit, Bellavita, you know. You always made people uncomfortable, but, well, his famous term was comfortably uncomfortable, which I've used many times, but this is another example of all of a sudden you're in a new situation and you think about some of the things we talked about here. And I think, and I hope that you find that same experience.
Yeah, so very different stories, all of them intertwined and connected, constantly coming back to their pals who they know they can rely on. One of the things, some of y'all know, there's this terrible Swedish man named Anders Strindberg, and don't laugh, he is. And we talk a lot about one of the skills, and I'm hoping you guys can bring out more of them, but one of the skills that we talk about wanting to, certainly not give, but to interact with our students about is operating in an ambiguous environment. I like it when there are lanes. I like it when there are rules to those lanes. And so much of what I've found over the last 22 years here is that what you have to do is to operate in an ambiguous environment where you're making up the rules for others or helping them to essentially do what Pat says, take a matchbook and turn it into a plan of attack. So ambiguity, I wonder if any of you think you operate in an ambiguous environment.
Kathy's raising her hand here, so I think I'll let her.
Put your arm down.
Fingers crossed.
Well, you know, I having lived in 2 different worlds, really, the law enforcement world versus the international domestic intelligence world, and they are different. Ambiguity is not a good thing in the law enforcement world. You know, there are rules, there's things you have to follow, there's structures, there's a number of things that if you don't follow one or mess up one, it could be very bad. In the domestic intelligence or international intelligence world, there aren't many rules. And you kind of operate with a sixth sense, and you go with your best judgment. There aren't many rules, there aren't many lanes, there aren't many structures. You just got to go along as you can and make the things you do count and accomplish what we're trying to do. I'll just add here one quick thing, because I've been asked several times, especially over the last few months, kind of the turmoil within the government and the all of the unknowns, and I'm not being any way political whatsoever. I'm just saying that is a fact. And I talked to a station chief who I've known for a long time, and she said, nothing's changed. We're doing exactly what we've always done, and we're going to keep doing it that way. That, to me, is pretty reassuring that we still have people that see the goal, the objective, and they're sticking to it. And I think that's what we ask of our international intelligence agencies.
So I know there's a lot of people in here that are in government and thinking about transitioning, and there's nothing more ambiguous than the transition from government to the private sector. I personally never thought of myself of doing anything other than being a police officer my whole life. You know, I started 23 years old, and it's what I did for 27 years, and I had no vision of what was next for me until I got the letter asking me to apply for the NFL, which I really didn't have any interest in. I would have been happy to stay the police chief for the rest of my life. But a good friend said to me, you know, when was the last time you had a job interview? You know, you're in an at-will position. You know, the mayor could have a bad hair day tomorrow and fire you, so maybe you should go through the process. So last time I had a job interview was 27 years ago, so maybe I should go through the process. So I went through the process just to see what it was like to go through an interview process for a job, knowing that inevitably someday my job as the police chief would end. Ultimately, even when I got to 16 interviews in New York, when it got to time for them to make the job offer, I spoken with my family and I said, I'm not going to take it if they offer it. I'm not ready to leave. I'm not ready to make this transition. But I wanted to go through the process, never thinking they were going to make the job offer until the day they picked up the phone and called and made the job offer. And convinced that I was going to turn the job down until the HR person didn't even take a breath from we'd like to offer you the job, and then told me what they were going to pay me. And I thought, can I call you back? So I realized at that point I was struggling to take care of my mom, who was aging and needed increasing care. It was very expensive. I'm on a government salary. And I thought, you know, I'd be foolish not to think first about my family and take this job. I can learn it. I didn't know anything about football. My boyfriend, when I was going up for the interviews, we would go to breakfast and he would take the little creamers and he would line them up on the table and tell me how many guys are on the line. I'm like, I don't think they're going to ask me that question. So I did decide to take the job, and it was a good decision, but talk about operating in an ambiguous environment. I knew nothing about football. I knew nothing about the private sector. When I got to the NFL, literally, when I got there, end of 2016, the NFL security department was 5 people. 5 people. The same 5 people who had been there for many, many years. And there was really not a single policy document. There was nothing in writing at all. I couldn't find anything. The office that I took over was completely empty. There was no files. There was no computer. There was not. I reported to Roger Goodell. I can't go and say, hey, you want to tell me a little bit about this job? To Roger Goodell. I had to figure it out, and I had to figure it out quick because I didn't want to lose this new job that I got. So I started relying on that critical thinking skills that I learned here and how to push through, you know, figuring out how to get the job done. And a lot of it was based on my experience and my education, but also a lot of it was based on just pulling together those critical thinking skills that we learned here. Bella Vita in the back of my mind constantly. So what? So what? So what? All the time with what is it you're trying to accomplish and how do you want to get this done? I now have over 60 people. I've incorporated cybersecurity into our department. We have a global operations intelligence command center that operates and supports us to do what we do. We now have a growing global footprint. moving to 16 international games. And 2 seasons from now, we'll have 16 international games. We're going to be playing in places like Abu Dhabi and Australia and Dublin and Madrid and Berlin. And, I say to people all the time, I did 27 years in MPD. I ran Special Operations Division. I ran narcotics. I ran patrol districts, and I thought I learned so much. I did counterterrorism and Homeland Security, traveled all over the world learning about terrorism. I've learned more in 8.5 years at the NFL than I learned in 27 years in policing, because the level of critical thinking and strategic planning that I have to do. And that was the other thing I learned here. I was very much an operator, always in the weeds, always hands-on, an operator, and they really did push me to be more strategic about the way I do things. And that is what allowed me to survive now for my 9th Super Bowl in the NFL. A lot of that came from what I learned here.
So for me, I'm an FBI guy, right? Ambiguity makes me uncomfortable. I need some guardrails around what we're going to do. So what I do is I always look for the parallels. Have I been in a situation that even approximates this? And have I laid the groundwork to succeed here? For me, when I was a supervisory senior resident agent in Rockford, Illinois, on Valentine's Day 2008, I got a call from Northern Illinois University saying that there had just been a shooting on the campus. This was a year after Virginia Tech. We didn't have the active shooter apparatus that's around us right now. And they said, can you come down here? And I said, of course I can come down there. But homicide is not a federal crime. Homicide is a state crime, and it's investigated by state authorities. So I didn't really have any authorities, but I had relationships down there. I had a good relationship with the sheriff. I had a good relationship with the city police chief, with the NIU police chief, and with the state police captain, all of whom had shared jurisdiction down there. And I had invested in those relationships early when I became an SSRA. What I knew was that the NIU police chief had threatened to arrest the police captain, the state police captain, at a homecoming event a couple of years before, and they hated each other. The sheriff was not allowed on the campus because the chief and the sheriff didn't get along very well, and the city police could not go onto the campus without the authority of the local police chief at NIU. So I knew that they had some challenged relationships. But I also knew that making order out of crisis was what I did. It's what I did in the FBI. It's what I did at the Crisis Management Unit. And I knew that I had relationships that I could leverage. I could play the role of the honest broker. So every time there's ambiguity for me, do I have the right people in place? Do I have the resources and relationships in place? And then can I leverage what I already know? Understanding the authorities is really important. So on my way down to that active shooter, I thought, how can I leverage the FBI jurisdiction to get involved in here? And at the time, we didn't have authority to investigate active shooters. That law changed about 3 years later. But what I did was I opened an FBI investigation because the gun that was used in the crime was manufactured in a state other than Illinois, and that's all I needed. So I understood my authorities, and then I could go into that room and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. If you want our help, this is what I would suggest that we do. And I carved out investigative task forces in each line of inquiry. Hey, we're going to look at the subject, we're going to look at his address, we're going to look at his weapons, we're going to look at his cars, all of that. And then on each one of those task forces, I put an NIU cop, I put a DeKalb City cop, I put a deputy sheriff, and I put a state police person on it. And when the NIU chief came to me and said, GB, can you guys do the crime scene inside? I said, you bet, chief, whatever you need. We don't do homicides, the state police does. So I'm going to have them help me. We got it. We'll do this. And then I turned to the state police captain and I said, I need your crime scene team. Would you come and help me? They wouldn't talk to each other, but they would talk to me because I'd invested in those relationships. So understand your authorities, understand your foundations, make some order out of chaos, and you can organize yourself out of that. You empower them, and then you coordinate their effort. And that's the same approach that I'm taking for the World Cup right now. We have 16 host cities playing across 3 nations to do 104 matches in 40 days. And we're running everywhere from Monterrey, Mexico to Toronto, Canada, from Seattle to Miami. There are a lot of different ways to skin this cat, and everybody does them a little bit differently. But my message is that we are one World Cup. We're not 16 World Cups. So we have to take some of the ambiguity out of that. And to do that, I talked to everybody in every one of those host cities and said, how do you organize for a major special event in your city? And I talk to the federal governments. I say, how do you identify what you're going to do for planning for a major special event? And I identified 18 different areas of planning focus that are common to all of those folks. And I said, okay, these are the 18 areas that we'll focus on. And we created a common definition for each of those areas, and we created 5 to 6 strategic objectives for each one of those. Got them to coalesce around those objectives, to buy off on them and say, yep, we agree to do this on our host city. And we created, out of complete ambiguity, a framework for safety and security that had everyone at the table, everyone with authorities who were empowered to make a difference, and collectively we came up with a framework that we're going to deliver. Now, I'm not going to tell them how to deliver it. I'm going to ask them to deliver it in the way they typically would deliver it, but anchor on the objectives that we've put together collectively. So we can put some guardrails around ambiguity to make some order out of chaos, and then collectively drive together.
Can I
to get
just
it
hit
done.
on one thing he said? I think it's really important.
Stop you. I don't
No, you can't. So I think what's really important about GB's points and all the points he's raised here today is the collaboration. Another thing that we learned a lot to deal with people from different disciplines and how important that is. When I got to the NFL, one of the biggest challenges was, well, first of all, we set the standard that all the stadiums and all the clubs have to follow. So the way it had historically been done is it would just push out from the league office and everybody else just had to comply. And we weren't very popular. And we also weren't very up to date on the things that we were doing. So the first thing I did was reach out to all the different disciplines, all the people that we had to work with to accomplish these standards that we produced to create committees. So I started forming, much like GB, leveraging those relationships, forming committees. I have a fire EMS committee. So representatives from all the fire EMS teams that work at all the stadiums at all 30 stadiums across the country, and now internationally as well. I brought a law enforcement committee, so representatives from all of those stadiums and clubs all across the country and internationally, putting them on a committee. And so instead of just pushing out new security standards that everybody had to meet, like drone mitigation standards, things that they have to spend a lot of money on to implement, we used our committees to vet those standards each year. So each year I use those committees, and there's 7 committees now, to go through the process, because when, at the end of the day, I've got to sit in front of 32 owners, billionaires, and ask them for a lot of money to implement the standards that I think are important. And if I don't have their buy-in, or there's anybody that's going to be naysaying in their ear, it's not going to happen. But I have never yet implemented a standard since I implemented those committees. I've never asked the ownership for new security standards, and some have been very costly and some have been very intrusive, without getting 100% support, because we have everybody in the room as the decisions are being made, and all the disciplines are involved, and so when the decisions are made, there's no pushback anywhere.
So one thing, I'm just supposed to be a moderator, but I'm going to talk too, so too bad. Ambiguity is important to me. One thing that I hear you guys saying and is that mission remains important. And transitioning from government to the private sector and maintaining your mission focus is super important to me. Recently, some of you know I took on a new position here, and I've been really fortunate. Greg and Jody have been very kind, and what I want to do here is to maintain my mission focus throughout that transition by helping the leadership here implement that. And I wonder, do you think about your private sector versus your government position differently when it comes to the mission? What is your mission now? I mean, is it to make money? Is that the mission? Is it? So how does that work?
I mean, I think, for me, the initial transition was a little difficult in keeping the mission focused, right? So people would say to me when I said I was leaving to go to the private sector, you know, how do you go from being the chief of police in the nation's capital to anything else and still feel like what you're doing is meaningful to people, right? It's meaningful as what you're doing when you're trying to secure the nation's capital. And about a week into my time at the NFL, I stumbled across what they call a sizzle reel. It's a video of little snippets, and you've seen this, of little snippets of every Super Bowl since the first Super Bowl. And as you look at it, and it's set to music, it's really a great video. But as you look at this video, you see across all these Super Bowls, presidents, Mickey Mouse, every entertainer who's ever been anybody on the planet, participating in these Super Bowls. So the production and what the Super Bowl means to America, the most watched sporting event, 127 million people watched the Super Bowl this past year. So it is really part of the fabric of America. And so if protecting that and making sure that that's safe, because if somebody hits the Super Bowl, that is going to fundamentally change things here in the United States. It will fundamentally change the way people go about life, the feeling of safety and security. So I tried to latch on to that and realize that my mission really hasn't changed. My mission's still exactly the same. It's protecting what we all enjoy about being Americans, and that sense of safety and security, and that we can come and go about our daily business and feel safe when we do things. And so I had to recreate a little bit of that mission. People ask me if I miss the law enforcement element of it. I always like to say, I don't miss the circus, I miss the clowns. But it's really the same circus. It's the same organization. I can't do my job without intelligence, so I had to build an intelligence capacity. I have to constantly innovate with technology. So I taught myself to understand. I managed some cybersecurity in the police department, but I taught myself to understand the cyber role and educated myself so I could bring the cyber role in, because they're a critical part of my intelligence apparatus. So I fought hard at the League to take over cybersecurity about 4 or 5 years ago, and so now they're part of the security department, not part of the IT department. So I built the same capacity to support my mission that I had in the police department. The NFL security department looks an awful lot like the Metropolitan Police Department in organization, but that's because my mission really has not changed. And the hard part is in the private sector, we don't generate revenue. The League prints money. They make their own money. But when we go every year for our budget approvals in front of the commissioner and in front of all the owners, everybody gets 2 slides, each department. I get 1 slide. The 2 slides everybody else gets is profit, right? And your investments, and where you're going to make your money, and then where you're going to spend. So where you're generating revenue and where you're going to spend. I only spend. I don't generate any revenue. But in a sense, you do generate a lot of revenue. You have to show that return on investment, and that return on investment is, Safety Act protections. We are 100% immune from liability should a terrorist attack occur, because we have such high standards from the Department of Homeland Security on our security standards. We have lower insurance premiums. So that's my job, is to make sure that I am saving them money and protecting them from losing money, but I don't generate revenue. But it is the same mission, just on a different scale.
For me, it's very similar. I started policing when I was 19 years old. I hadn't even been to the police academy yet, and in Minnesota they had a part-time licensing program, and my police department in my town needed a little bit of help. I knew the police chief, and I said, well, I'm here to help. And he said, okay, we'll put you through the licensing program. At 19 years old, you can't buy your own bullets. So my mother bought my bullets, the department gave me my gun, and I went to work. And I'd never been to an academy. And I had been policing since that time. I've been an EMT for 37 years, and I still ride out on an ambulance, still nationally registered. So keeping people safe and keeping them secure was just kind of built into my DNA. And after I retired from the FBI in 2019, after 23 years there and about 31 years total time in law enforcement, I was trying to find myself. And I didn't have something I went to when I retired from the FBI. I'd started my own LLC, and I was doing some consulting. Ironically, it's called SEAR Group. But I was doing some consulting. I was doing pretty well at it, so the money thing wasn't really the motivator. But I found I was missing the mission a little bit. And by happenstance, Kathy called me in January of 2020, and she had a question on drones, because I was working for a counter-drone startup at the time, and we were just bantering back and forth, and she was doing some really great work, a thought leader in the space, but she had a couple of questions that were technology-based, and that was what I was dabbling in at the time. We started going back and forth. And I said, if that international director job for the NFL ever came open again, I'd appreciate you considering me for that. And she said, are you serious? And I said, well, yeah, or I wouldn't have said that. She said, I'm getting ready to offer that job to somebody today. If you're interested in the job, I'll put you through a process. I won't tell anybody that I know you, but I'll put you through the process. Can you get me a resume by the end of the day? And I got that resume to her by the end of the day. A couple of days later, I had one interview, then I had another interview, then I had another interview, and soon I was hired to be on her team. Nobody knew that we were connected from NPS. She made it so that I had to do it on my own merit. But I had the opportunity then to learn what she had done in her transition for 3 years and to step back into a mission mentality that mattered. And the mission was keep people safe. And that's what kept me anchored. As we got into the summer of 2020 and we had the George Floyd protests and we had COVID unraveling all at the same time, I was really struggling a little bit because the league took some social justice positions that I didn't really agree with. The players were saying some things that were really counter to the law enforcement community that I had served for so long. And I had some real internal struggles. And my wife just kept keeping me anchored on, your job is to keep people safe. The rest of it is noise, just keep people safe. And so that's the mission that I anchored on through the entire time that I had with the NFL. And I had the great opportunity to help grow the program internationally with the NFL. And I had a great opportunity to do some really neat and innovative things with drones because Kathy had a vision that aligned with my vision. And that mission was we were going to keep people safe. And before I got to the league, for 15 years, drones were bad, full stop. And nobody was going to consider drones for any positive purpose at all. But Kathy and I were talking one day, and she said, you know, if we don't identify the landscape and carve the landscape out in the way that's most meaningful to us, the government's going to come in and tell us how we have to do it. So we created a program to integrate drones for commercial use, for good use, for positive use. At the same time, we were managing to keep people safe with the counter-drone program. So it was always mission first, but the creative way that we could approach that and the latitude that we had in the private sector to be able to be more creative in the way that we approach it is really empowering. So the mission stays central to the focus, but the way we get to execute the mission now is a little bit different. And again, I wouldn't be in this role now, but for the experience I had at CHDS, because that's where the network started with Kathy. We've stayed in touch for 20 years. I have learned and done some things that complement the skill set that she had. She gave me a tremendous opportunity to do some really neat and innovative things. And when I went overseas to put the overseas games on, first I had to seek to understand how soccer was policed, and then reverse engineer it so that we could police American football. But I learned so much in how they police soccer that it was a pretty natural extension when FIFA came and asked me if I'd be interested in this position to say, okay, now I have to reverse engineer NFL stadiums and teach them how soccer is policed. So it's really it's a great project. It was a hard decision to leave Kathy's team and to leave the NFL, but I was prepared for that. I had the skills, I had the background, I had the experiences, and importantly, had the stakeholders in my network that I could continue to leverage as we keep the mission focused.
Yeah, so about 148 years ago, I was a cop, and yeah, we did ride horses and had wheel guns. But at that time, Pat was, he was a SWAT commander over at Ventura PD, and I was on the SWAT team at Ventura. So, and I really couldn't imagine him doing anything other than being a spy, being a SWAT commander, buying dope, that kind of thing. And then you came here to teach. And how do you see the continuation? Because teaching is a very different animal than...
You know, it's interesting listening to Kathy and GB and Dave's question. The word mission is really loaded. It's very complicated. It can get out of hand. It can get so enormous that you lose sight of the basic things that you're supposed to do. And one of my goals in life was to make whatever mission you had for your particular agency or department, is that you ask the chief or the CEO, sure, they know it, but do the people working for you know it? Can they recite or can they tell you what their mission is? One of the best things that ever happened in my police career was I got a call from the city manager one night about 11 o'clock, which is never good. I thought, oh boy, what do we do now? And he said, I just had to give you a call because in almost 30 years of being a city manager, I've never, ever seen this happen. He said, I was downtown, I was eating dinner, I came outside, one of your new officers, she'd been out of training for about 6 months, 22 years old. I walked up to her, introduced myself, she knew who I was, number one, and I said, what are the 4 things your chief says are your mission for your department? And she rattled them off word for word exactly what you say. And he goes, I've never seen that before. So I had to call and say, congratulations, they're listening to what you're saying. And I think in teaching, we get kind of lost in that word too. You know, you get so many different things, and part of it is the smart people you're talking to in the class, and everybody hears you, but they all interpret it a little bit different. And so I think establishing what that mission is, regardless, chief, head of security for the NFL, FIFA, it doesn't matter. You have to be able to articulate it, and you have to have people that hear it and can say the same thing. One thing I will add, when GB told me he was, what the job he just took with FIFA, and I said, you do know soccer fans are a different breed of cat. It is, you say football, but they say football, and they mean something different. And I told him, I was in Bogota, and the Colombian national team played somebody, one of their arch rivals. It was probably Peru or some other South American country. And one of the Colombian players scored a goal for the other team, and they lost. He kicked it in the wrong goal. The next day, the Medellin cartel whacked him at his house in front of his family. I said, so, GB, good luck, buddy.
Well, much like Kathy, I knew nothing about soccer. No. If I may, just one other thing when you're talking about mission and mission set and how to connect that so people understand really why they're there. One of the things that I tried to do when I was doing the international games was to infuse a little bit of cultural competence in the teams and in the people that I was working with who were the Americans that were in another country. And so you'll learn a little snippet of the language and you use some of that or whatever. And one of the things that struck me with the Metropolitan Police Department, the London Metropolitan Police Department, was they start every one of their briefings with their mission focus so that everybody knows what it is. So there's 3 things, and they say prevent or preserve life and property, prevent crime and disorder, and maintain the king's peace. And that so struck me when they said that, because everybody would say it at every one of their briefings, that I incorporated that into the briefing to the referees and to the team security directors so that they would get a little flavor of the Metropolitan Police when we did our 100-minute meeting before the game would kick off. So the police would give a threat briefing, and I would always ask them, hey, can you give us the mission of the Metropolitan Police Department, so people would feel that UK connection as they were getting ready to play their games in London.
I mean, really, GB did an amazing job. He's very humble about it, but the work he did in the international market, we started expanding international so quickly, and the cultural thing is not something that should be missed. We had played in Mexico and we played in London, really not terribly dramatically different cultures. Mexico, well, yes, but it's just know that you're not going to get what they say you're going to get when you get there. But when we started playing in Germany and in Brazil, where people are speaking Portuguese and speaking German, there was a lot of cultural differences that made a huge impact on us, and GB had to navigate through that. When our first couple games in Germany, we did Munich, Frankfurt, and then we're now moving on to Berlin. But he tried to master the German as well, and his favorite saying from the Germans, who were really, in Munich, very different than working with the German police in Frankfurt, but in Munich, their favorite line was, not to prove them.
Yeah, they would always say, it is not possible. Whatever we asked for, it is not possible.
Nothing was possible with the Munich police. But what really struck me was, and we had a near catastrophe in Munich because of the cultural differences, and we did not fully grasp, although we were aware of them, we didn't fully grasp them until the crisis hit us. And one is, we said, we don't really need interpreters because they speak pretty good English and we can communicate well during all of our planning processes. We were concerned that they didn't do any kind of unified command. The police and the fire, we knew that they normally on game days, the police officers set on level 4 in a command center and the firefighters set on level 8 on the other side of the stadium. And, you know, the stadium operations team set in another room. We're used to everybody being in the same room and doing a unified command. So in our first Munich game, we had a crowd crush issue. Very early arriving crowds, poor design by our events team out with a large shop outside. We literally had a very, very dangerous situation hit us very, very quickly. while all the authorities had agreed to sit with us in a single room in NFL control on game day, we were in there by ourselves with a bunch of name tents for the other agencies, and none of them showed up in that room. We had nobody from transportation to slow the trains down, while we, in fact, were going to ask them to slow the trains down from 11 minutes, dropping every 11 minutes, to dropping, every 15 minutes. They'd increased them to dropping every 6 minutes, and we didn't even know it. And the crowd just kept folding in on itself, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So they called us to the crisis room, and we go to the crisis room, and all the people we'd worked with for almost 2 years that spoke perfectly good English, there was not a single word of English spoken. The entire crisis was unfolding in front of us, and they were speaking only German. So we had to navigate through a pretty difficult situation, but if it wasn't for GB's role in developing all of these international markets and navigating through all these tough situations, we were able to work our way through that, but we've never had that challenge again because GB has factored in how do we accommodate all of these different cultures that we have to work in, and so Brazil went very smoothly.
Thanks, folks. Have some chow.